In the highlands of northern Ethiopia, near the shores of Lake Tana, there is a community that prayed in an ancient language, kept a form of Judaism older than the version most of the world recognizes, and insisted for generations that their ancestors came from Jerusalem. For centuries, almost nobody outside their villages believed them. Then geneticists opened up their DNA, expecting a simple answer. What they found instead was a genetic signature so complicated that it reopened a debate historians thought had already been settled. This is the story of the Beta Israel, the community the world came to know as Ethiopian Jews. And it begins not with a scientist, but with a question that traveled for hundreds of years before modern technology could even attempt to answer it. Where did these people actually come from? By the time this question reached a genetics laboratory, it had already survived medieval travelers, colonial explorers, religious councils, and Israeli government commissions. Each one had a theory. Almost none of them agreed. Some believed the Beta Israel descended from an ancient Israelite tribe that had wandered into East Africa thousands of years ago. Others believed they were Ethiopian farmers and craftspeople who adopted Jewish practice sometime in the Middle Ages with no ancestral connection to the Middle East at all. For a long time, the debate stayed where debates like this usually stay, in the realm of legend, scripture, and speculation. Then DNA sequencing matured enough to actually test it, and that is where this story gets strange, because the genome did not hand scientists a clean verdict. It handed them a contradiction. Before we get to the laboratory results, it helps to understand what was actually being debated, because the disagreement was never really about religion. It was about migration, memory, and how a community can hold onto an identity across thousands of years, even when the physical evidence for that identity is almost impossible to find. The Beta Israel themselves told a specific story about their origins. Ethiopian tradition, recorded in a text called the Kebra Nagast, describes the Queen of Sheba traveling to Jerusalem, meeting King Solomon, and returning to Ethiopia with a son named Menelik. According to this account, Menelik later brought elements of Israelite religious practice back with him, and his followers carried that tradition forward for generations. Other versions of Beta Israel oral history connect the community to the ancient tribe of Dan, one of the tribes described in the Hebrew Bible as scattered after the fall of the Kingdom of Israel. For centuries, mainstream Jewish religious authorities outside Ethiopia were unsure what to make of any of this. The Beta Israel practiced a form of Judaism that had developed largely in isolation. They observed the Sabbath, kept dietary laws, followed purity practices connected to the priesthood described in the Torah, and prayed in Ge'ez, an ancient liturgical language rather than Hebrew. And they did not have the Talmud, the body of rabbinic law that shaped Judaism everywhere else in the world after the destruction of the Second Temple. To some observers, that isolation was exactly what you would expect from a community that had split off from mainstream Judaism in antiquity, before rabbinic tradition fully developed. To others, it looked like evidence of something else entirely, a local African religious movement that had absorbed biblical practices through contact with the outside world, centuries later than the community's own legends claimed. That second theory has a name among historians. It is often called the conversion hypothesis, and it argues that the Beta Israel formed as a distinct group sometime during the medieval period, possibly through contact with Jewish communities elsewhere in the region, or through an internal religious movement that adopted Old Testament practice without direct migration from the Middle East at all. Some historians who support this view point to the Aksumite Empire, the powerful Ethiopian kingdom that rose roughly 2,000 years ago and later adopted Christianity as the setting where a distinct Israelite religious identity could plausibly have taken shape locally, long after any direct migration from the Middle East, through trade contact, religious debate, and the slow spread of biblical text and practice along ancient caravan routes. It is worth noting that this was never a debate confined to Ethiopia. Medieval travelers occasionally wrote about a Jewish kingdom said to exist somewhere beyond the known world, and a 9th century traveler known as Eldad Hadani famously claimed descent from the tribe of Dan and described a Jewish community living in East Africa. Historians still argue about how much of his account was genuine reporting and how much was embellishment. But accounts like his kept the idea of an African Israelite population circulating in Jewish communities elsewhere for centuries, long before anyone could test the claim scientifically. Notice what both explanations have in common. Neither one can be proven from religious texts or oral tradition alone. Stories can be reshaped over centuries. Legends can absorb outside influences and then present them as ancient memory. If two explanations both fit the historical evidence, you need a different kind of evidence, something that does not rely on memory or interpretation at all. That is what DNA offered. Unlike a story passed down through generations, a genome carries a physical record of ancestry. It does not forget, and it does not exaggerate. If the Beta Israel really descended from an ancient Middle Eastern population, that ancestry should still be detectable and coded in specific genetic markers, even after thousands of years of intermarriage and migration. If they did not, the genome should look almost entirely like the populations around them in the Ethiopian highlands. So researchers expected a clear answer, one population or the other. What they got was neither. One of the earliest large-scale genetic studies to include the Beta Israel came in 2009, led by geneticist Sarah Tishkoff as part of a much larger project mapping genetic diversity across the African continent. That study looked at what is called autosomal DNA, the genetic material inherited from both parents combined, rather than tracing a single line through the mother or the father alone. Autosomal DNA is useful because it reflects a population's overall ancestry, blended across many generations, rather than just one narrow lineage. When the Tishkoff team analyzed the Beta Israel using this method, the results placed them predominantly within what researchers called the Cushitic genetic cluster, a pattern typically associated with East African populations, rather than with any Middle Eastern or broader Jewish diaspora cluster. On its face, that was another point in favor of the conversion hypothesis. But this early study was working with a smaller and more limited set of comparison populations than what would come later, and researchers were careful not to treat one dataset as the final word. The first major genome-wide study of Jewish ancestry that included the Beta Israel was published in 2010, led by geneticist Doron Bahar and an international team of collaborators. The study compared genetic patterns across 14 Jewish diaspora communities and dozens of non-Jewish populations from around the Old World. For most Jewish communities studied, from European Ashkenazi Jews to North African and Middle Eastern Jewish groups, the results were fairly consistent. These populations formed a tight genetic cluster, most closely related to other Middle Eastern populations, such as the Druze and Cypriots, distinct from the very populations they had lived alongside in the diaspora for centuries. That finding, on its own, supported the idea of a shared Middle Eastern origin for most of world Jewry. But when the researchers looked at the Beta Israel, the pattern broke. Instead of clustering with other Jewish populations, or even with Middle Eastern groups generally, the Beta Israel clustered closely with their non-Jewish Ethiopian neighbors, particularly Semitic-speaking groups such as the Amhara and the Tigray. Genetically, they looked far more like other people from the Ethiopian highlands than like Jewish communities anywhere else in the world. At first glance, that result seemed to settle the debate in favor of the conversion hypothesis. If the Beta Israel were truly descended from an ancient Middle Eastern population, why would their overall genome look almost indistinguishable from their Ethiopian neighbors? But researchers were careful not to treat that as a final answer, because the same 2010 study had already shown something important in a different Jewish community entirely. The Bene Israel of India also clustered genetically with their local neighbors, rather than with other Jewish populations. Yet earlier research on the Y-chromosome, the genetic material passed down almost unchanged from father to son, had already identified a real paternal link between Bene Israel men and Middle Eastern populations. In other words, a community could carry authentic ancient ancestry from a specific lineage, while still looking, on the whole, mostly like the population that surrounded them for thousands of years. Overall genetic clustering measures the majority of a population's ancestry. It does founding contribution buried underneath centuries of local intermarriage. That distinction turned the story in a new direction. If overall clustering could not settle the question, the next place to look was more specific. Researchers began examining maternal DNA, the genetic material passed down through the mother's line, known as mitochondrial DNA, to see if a different piece of the picture might tell a different story. The results were genuinely unexpected. Roughly half of the maternal lineages traced in Beta Israel samples belonged to haplogroup L, a lineage type found almost exclusively in populations across Africa. That part fit neatly with the idea of deep local ancestry. But the remaining maternal lineages were not African at all. They belonged to haplogroups such as R, naught, M1, W, and U, lineage types associated with populations across Eurasia, from the Middle East through parts of Europe and Asia. This meant that a substantial share of Beta Israel maternal ancestry did not originate in East Africa. It pointed somewhere else. And this Eurasian genetic signal in the maternal line closely resembled patterns already found in other Ethiopian highland populations, not something unique to the Beta Israel specifically. That detail mattered more than it first appeared, because it suggested the Eurasian genetic influence might be older and broader than a single founding Jewish migration, something woven into the population history of the entire highland region. So now the picture had three separate threads pulling in different directions. Overall genome structure that resembled local Ethiopian populations, a maternal line that was roughly half African and half Eurasian, and a community with strong internal tradition of Israelite ancestry that had survived for centuries in relative isolation. None of these threads, on their own, could explain the whole story. That is when researchers turned to a different kind of evidence entirely, evidence that did not come from the Beta Israel at all, but from the broader Ethiopian population around them. A separate line of research looked at genetic diversity across Ethiopia as a whole, comparing dozens of ethnic groups from different regions. This research identified evidence of a significant wave of gene flow into the Ethiopian highlands from populations connected to the Levant, the region, including modern-day Israel, Syria, and the eastern Mediterranean coast, occurring roughly 3,000 years ago. That timing is notable because it lines up closely with the period described in Ethiopian tradition around the legend of the Queen of Sheba and the founding of the Solomonic line. Some geneticists who worked on this research suggested that the pattern of ancient gene flow into the region was consistent with a historical contact event between Ethiopia and populations to the north, occurring around the time frame the old legend describes. This is where the investigation demands real caution, because that particular finding was about Ethiopian highland populations broadly, not the Beta Israel specifically. It does not, by itself, prove that the Beta Israel descend from an ancient Israelite founding population. What it does show is that the region as a whole absorbed genetic contact from the direction of the Levant around 3,000 years ago, which means any theory about Beta Israel origins has to be considered against a backdrop where that kind of ancient contact was already happening across the wider highland population for reasons that may have had nothing to do with a specifically Jewish migration at all. If you feel like the evidence keeps circling back to uncertainty instead of resolving cleanly, you are following the investigation correctly, because that is exactly where serious researchers found themselves. And this is usually the point where a documentary would promise you a tidy resolution. This one will not, because the honest scientific picture is more interesting than a tidy resolution. And if you want to keep following where the actual evidence leads instead of where the legend wants it to go, stay with me, because the next layer of research tried to put a number on when the Beta Israel actually became a distinct community, and that number surprised almost everyone who studied it. In 2012, a research team led by geneticist Harry Oster proposed a specific model for how the Beta Israel might have formed. Rather than treating the community as either purely local converts or purely ancient migrants, the study suggested a middle path. It proposed that the Beta Israel community was founded roughly 2,000 years ago by a relatively small number of Jewish migrants who settled in the region and were gradually joined over many generations by local Ethiopian populations who adopted their religious practice and were absorbed into the community. Under this model, the earliest core of the group could be genuinely rooted in ancient Jewish ancestry, while the community's genetic profile today reflects centuries of local intermarriage layered on top of that original founding population. That would explain why the Beta Israel resemble their Ethiopian neighbors so strongly in overall ancestry, while still carrying a real, if diluted, thread connecting back to a Levantine origin. More recent large-scale ancient DNA research has added another layer to this picture. A major 2020 study examining ancient and modern genomes from across the Levant, led by researchers including Ayelet Agranat Tamer, found that Beta Israel genetic ancestry today is predominantly East African in origin, but with a meaningful minority component on the order of about 1/5 of their overall ancestry, showing similarity to Middle Eastern populations and to genetic patterns associated with Bronze Age populations from the region historically linked to ancient Israelite communities. That is not proof of an unbroken bloodline. It is a measurable signal sitting inside an otherwise heavily East African genome, in roughly the proportion you would expect if a smaller founding population had been absorbed into a much larger local population over 2,000 years, generation after generation, exactly the kind of slow demographic dilution the 2012 model had already proposed. So where does that leave the original question, the one that had been argued over for centuries before anyone could test it directly? The honest answer, the one supported by the actual evidence rather than by either side of the old debate, is layered. It is confirmed that Beta Israel genetic ancestry today is overwhelmingly East African, closely tied to neighboring highland Ethiopian populations, particularly Semitic-speaking groups like the Amhara and Tigray. It is also confirmed that a meaningful minority portion of their ancestry, both in the maternal line and in genome-wide studies, traces back toward the Middle East in patterns broadly consistent with the wider Levantine gene flow documented across the Ethiopian highlands roughly 3,000 years ago. It is likely, based on the founder model proposed by Oster and colleagues, that a smaller ancient Jewish population became the founding core of the community roughly 2,000 years ago, gradually absorbing local converts over many centuries. It remains genuinely disputed whether that founding population itself descended directly from ancient Israelite migrants, or whether the community's Jewish identity formed later through contact and conversion with the Middle Eastern genetic signal arriving as part of the same broader regional gene flow that shaped Ethiopian populations generally, rather than through a distinctly religious migration. And it is currently unknown, and may remain unknown, exactly which historical event or events carried that Levantine ancestry into the highlands, whether ancient trade routes, migration connected to the incense trade across the Red Sea, movement of populations along the Nile, or something closer to the old legend of a founding dynasty than modern scholars have been comfortable admitting. If this feels like an unsatisfying place to land, consider what it actually tells us. For centuries, this question could only be argued using scripture, oral tradition, and colonial-era speculation, none of which could be tested. Modern genetics did not hand down a simple verdict, but it did something more valuable. It replaced guesswork with evidence, and it showed that the true story sits somewhere between the two extremes that had dominated the debate for generations, closer to a nuanced, layered history of ancient contact, absorption, and religious continuity than to either a fully invented identity or an unbroken bloodline stretching back to Solomon. There is a larger implication buried inside this story, one that goes beyond the Beta Israel specifically. It shows how fragile the line can be between historical memory and genetic reality, and how a community's own account of its origins, passed down for thousands of years, can turn out to be neither pure myth nor precise history, but something layered in between, shaped by both. It also shows the limits of modern science itself. Genetics can measure ancestry with extraordinary precision, but it cannot always tell you which historical story explains that ancestry. The numbers can confirm that ancient contact happened. They usually cannot tell you the full human story behind why. In 1975, Israel's chief rabbinate formally recognized the Beta Israel as descendants of the ancient tribe of Dan, a religious ruling, not a scientific one, that opened the door to mass immigration under Israel's law of return. Between the 1980s and the 1990s, thousands of Ethiopian Jews were airlifted to Israel in a series of operations, including Operation Moses and Operation Solomon, reuniting a community with a homeland it had claimed for centuries, based on a story that modern DNA research has only partially been able to confirm and only partially been able to explain. That is, in many ways, the deepest lesson of this investigation. Identity is not always something science can fully verify or fully dismiss. Sometimes the evidence supports a story. Sometimes it complicates a story. And sometimes, as with the Beta Israel, it does both at once, confirming enough ancient connection to keep the old legend alive, while leaving enough uncertainty that historians and geneticists are still arguing about the details today. There is also a human dimension to this research that is easy to lose inside the statistics. For the Beta Israel community itself, the genetic findings have never been treated as the final word on identity. Religious identity, cultural continuity, and lived tradition do not depend on a laboratory result. A community can hold on to Sabbath observance, dietary law, and centuries of prayer and geese, regardless of what a haplogroup frequency chart says about their maternal ancestry. Scientists studying the Beta Israel have generally been careful to separate the genetic question, which is about population history, from the religious and cultural question, which is about identity, practice, and belonging. The two are related, but they are not the same thing, and collapsing them into one another is part of what made this debate so contentious for so long in the first place. If you want to keep following investigations where the evidence is allowed to stay complicated instead of being forced into a neat conclusion, subscribe to the channel because there are more stories like this one waiting, cases where science and history collide, and the truth turns out to be more interesting than either side of the original argument. The genetic record answered part of the mystery of the Beta Israel. It confirmed that something ancient really did connect the Ethiopian highlands to the Middle East, roughly 3,000 years ago, around the same era their own legends describe. But it could not confirm whether that connection began with a migration, a conversion, or something in between, and it likely never will with the certainty either side of the old debate was hoping for. The investigation solved one question only to uncover a deeper one underneath it, and that question, about where identity ends and ancestry begins, is still being written.